When your own government insiders are privately admitting they expect to lose a by-election in what was a 13,000 majority Labor seat, and they're saying it was a choice between almost certain defeat and an even worse disaster, you're not doing politics anymore, you're doing damage limitation. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where senior Labour figures have conceded behind closed doors that they expect to lose Gorton and Denton, possibly coming third behind Reform and the Greens, after blocking Andy Burnham from standing. We're talking about a seat Labour won comfortably just months ago, now being written off as probably lost. Reform's calling it a referendum on Starmer. Only 16% of Labour voters think blocking Burnham was right. Now almost 3 times as many Labour voters disagreeing with the decision as supporting it. And we're 30 MPs away from the number needed to trigger a leadership challenge. This is a prime minister 6 months into a landslide majority, watching his own party predict humiliating defeat while preparing for potential leadership challenges. Let's break down this spectacular collapse. So, senior Labour figures, these are people inside government with access to internal polling and campaign intelligence, have privately conceded they expect to lose this by-election. Not that it'll be close, not that it'll be difficult, but that they expect to lose. And some are even fearing Labour could come third behind Reform and the Greens, which would be absolutely catastrophic in a seat they won with a 13,000 majority in 2024. Think about what coming third means. It means Reform wins, Greens come second, and Labour, the party that's actually in government, the party that held this seat comfortably for decades, finishes third. That's not just a loss, that's a humiliation that would dominate news cycles for weeks and fundamentally shake confidence in Starmer's leadership. It would be the kind of result that triggers serious questions about whether the government can survive. A senior government figure told The Times, and this is absolutely brutal honesty, realistically, we know that we're going to lose, but it was a question of what was worse, losing a by-election or losing control of Greater Manchester, which would have been a total disaster. Read that again. They know they're going to lose. That's not spin. That's not pessimistic scenario planning. That's accepted reality. The only question was which loss to take. The calculation was that losing the Gorton and Denton parliamentary seat to Reform is less catastrophic than allowing Burnham to stand, win, trigger a Greater Manchester mayoral by-election, and potentially lose that to Reform too. So they chose parliamentary defeat over potential mayoral defeat because at least a parliamentary loss is one disaster rather than two. That's not governing. That's choosing which limb to amputate. Another party source said no one expects victory, which is even more definitive. No one. Not optimists hoping for the best, not campaign managers with private polling showing narrow paths to victory. Literally no one in the party expects to win. But then other sources insisted they're not writing the seat off and need to be quick out of the blocks to position Labour as the principal challenger to Reform. That last bit is fascinating because it reveals Labour's actual goal isn't winning. It's coming second instead of third. They want to be the principal challenger to Reform, meaning Reform's expected to win, and Labour's fighting the Greens for second place. That's the state of Labour's ambition in a seat they won with 51% of the vote 7 months ago. From comfortable victory to fighting for second place in less than a year. The decision to hold the by-election on February 26, decoupled from the May elections, is explicitly about damage limitation. Labour's trying to minimize political impact by having this defeat, and they're clearly expecting defeat, happen separately from the big May elections. That way, when they lose Gorton and Denton, it's one bad news cycle rather than part of a broader story about Labour getting battered across England, Scotland, and Wales simultaneously. But that strategy only works if the Gorton and Denton loss is seen as an isolated incident rather than a symptom of broader problems. Given Labour's polling collapse, the internal civil war over Burnham, and the mounting pressure on Starmer, treating this as isolated is going to be very difficult. The claim that at least 50 Labour MPs have signed a letter criticizing Starmer's decision and that 80 is the number needed to trigger a leadership challenge is the subtext to everything happening. We're 30 signatures away from a formal challenge to a prime minister 6 months after a landslide election victory. That's historically unprecedented and shows how badly Starmer's authority has collapsed. Lord Hermer, the Attorney General and close Starmer friend, telling MPs not to focus on internal battles and instead talk up government successes is damage control that's probably coming too late. You can't just tell MPs to stop being angry when they're watching a preventable disaster unfold. And what successes are they supposed to talk up when approval ratings are in the toilet and by-elections are being written off as expected losses? The fact that only 2 MPs, both far left, raised the Burnham issue at the Monday night meeting is being spun by loyalists as containing the backlash. But that's nonsense. MPs not raising it at an official meeting doesn't mean they're not furious. It just means they're organizing privately through letters and back channels rather than giving leadership advance warning of rebellion. The YouGov polling is absolutely devastating and shows how disconnected leadership is from their own voters. Just 16% of Labor voters think blocking Burnham was right, compared to 46% who think it was wrong. That's nearly 3 times as many Labor voters disagreeing with the decision as supporting it. Among the wider public, it's 12% right versus 44% wrong. When your own voters overwhelmingly think you made the wrong decision by nearly 3-1, you've catastrophically misjudged the politics. Starmer's calculation that blocking Burnham protects his leadership is undermined by his own voters saying it was wrong. They're not protecting him, they're isolating him from his base. The overall YouGov numbers are even worse. Labor on 21% nationally, 4 points below Reform at 25%. The Tories at 17% and the Greens at 16%. Labor's in second place nationally behind Reform, and the gap between second and fourth is just 5 points. That's a 4-party system where Labor's barely ahead of parties that were nowhere near them in the general election. Labor pointing to winning the seat with a 13,000 majority in 2024 when Gaza concern was at its height is trying to suggest current conditions aren't worse than then. But that argument ignores that Labor support has collapsed nationally since the election, that blocking Burnham has created specific local anger, and that Reform has surged dramatically. Past results don't predict future performance when the political landscape shifted so dramatically. Nigel Farage admitting Burnham would have galvanized the anti-Starmer vote, pushed turnout up, and been very difficult to beat is both honest assessment and brutal indictment of Labor's decision. Farage is saying frankly that Labor blocking their strongest candidate made his job easier. He thought Reform might come a good second against Burnham, now he thinks they can win. That's Labor's main opponent thanking them for the gift. A Reform source calling this a referendum on Starmer and saying if you want to get rid of Starmer, there's only one party to vote for is perfect messaging. It's not about local issues or parliamentary representation. It's about sending a message to the Prime Minister that voters want him gone. That's emotionally resonant, simple, and gives voters a clear reason to back Reform, even if they're not natural Reform supporters. The fight being deeply divisive, with Greens pushing for pro-Gaza vote and Reform pitching as chance to punish Starmer, means Labor's getting squeezed from both sides. Progressive voters angry about Gaza go Green, working-class voters angry about Starmer go Reform, and Labor's left with diminished support from their traditional coalition. That's the nightmare scenario for any party. A Labor loss, which their own insiders expect, increases internal pressure on Starmer massively. 50 MPs have already signed the letter, worth 30 from a leadership challenge, and losing this by-election proves every critic right. The people who said blocking Burnham was catastrophic get vindicated. The people defending the decision look foolish, and Starmer's authority evaporates. The internal tensions are clearly enormous, with different factions briefing different things. Some saying it's definitely lost, others saying they're not writing it off, others saying focus on government successes. That's not coordinated messaging, that's chaos with everyone scrambling to position themselves for the fallout. The fact that senior government figures are speaking anonymously to the Times, admitting defeat, shows they're distancing themselves from the decision while still being part of government. They're creating plausible deniability for when it goes wrong, establishing that they knew it was a mistake but were overruled or went along reluctantly. That's the kind of briefing that happens when people are preparing for leadership change. What happens if Labour does lose, or come third as some fear? Starmer's position becomes untenable. You can't survive losing a 13,000 majority seat 7 months after winning it, while your own voters say your decisions were wrong and MPs are organizing against you. The 30 more signatures for a leadership challenge would materialize quickly, and Starmer would face the choice of fighting a challenge he'd probably lose or resigning. If you want every update on whether Labour actually loses Gorton and Denton as their own insiders expect, whether more MPs signed a letter pushing toward leadership challenge, whether Starmer survives this crisis or becomes the shortest-serving Labour Prime Minister in history, subscribe to UK Political Insight immediately. We're covering every development constantly because this is history in the making. Hit that notification bell so you miss nothing. Drop a comment predicting the result, whether Labour loses, comes third, or somehow pulls off an upset, whether Starmer survives if they lose.